Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class. This is going to be the first day of the first unit, which is on ancient Greek literature and ancient Greek thought and ancient Greek mythology as well. So we're going to start the first unit on ancient Greece with a little subunit called Greek mythology. That's our first section we're going to cover for the course. Now, we have a grouping of notes that go along with this. So I'm going to read through the notes. I'm also going to read through or kind of follow along with the slideshow. So if we bounce back and forth, just try to keep up with that. So we begin with Greek mythology. Now, why do we start with Greek mythology? Why is Greek mythology such a typical topic within the humanities? Well, a couple of different reasons. The most basic and kind of practical reasons are just simply that if you're trying to gain a understanding of the humanities or of Western literature, of Western civilization, there are really only two, I would say, two really powerful inspirational sources or inspirational kind of group of materials that have exerted a huge amount of influence and also have a huge amount of attracting power to them in Western civilization for about the past 3,000 years or so. And those two sources are, number one, the Bible. The Bible has been the main driving force of ideological influences on Western civilization, and as well as the imagination of the Western world. Now, the other one has been Greek mythology, specifically, I would say like Homer and as encoded in the Roman text, Ovid, so the collection of the ancient Greek stories that we have in Ovid. These two bodies of works, so all the religious, the biblical stories, whether Old or New Testament, and all the stories of ancient Greek mythology, whether it be smaller myths or the works of Homer, have had this incredible influence on our imagination and therefore our culture and therefore our entire civilization. So it's worth knowing. It's worth understanding. That's the most practical reason why, is that it's freaking popular. People just go after this stuff a lot. Now, the other reasons why I think it's worth looking at Greek mythology is simply that, as a second reason, is simply that if you're trying to understand Western thoughts and particularly Western literature, the Greek myths, again, have been referenced and have been influencing those works profoundly for quite a while. So we can track, or we can see all the inspirations, all the links, all the issues in those stories as well. Now, as a third major reason why we should maybe pay attention or kind of look at the Greek myths, our number one, our number three, just because they're beautiful. They're really, really interesting. They're very captivating. They're very entrancing and enchanting to us. So, why not? Why not kind of just drink that cup to its fullest and see all the enjoyment that we can get out of it? Okay. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot of different reasons why we should look at this, and it is absolutely worth looking at, particularly, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not familiar with them already. So even if you are a fifth grader, if you're a ninth grader, if you're, in college, if you're past college, it's worth understanding the Greek myths, because for 3,000 years, everybody around us has been absorbing these things. They've just had such an attractive and kind of influential power. So one thing I like to tell my students, and one thing I really like to sort of preach to my students, is to not be self-referential in our educational process. And what do I mean by self-referential? What I mean by self-referential is simply this. If you're watching something, or if you're reading something, or if you're absorbing some form of artwork, and your immediate reaction and kind of like in the first couple minutes of engaging with it are kind of like, seems stupid, seems boring, seems uninteresting to me, et cetera, et cetera. The governing phrase there is "to me," okay? You need to, in order to not be self-referential, you need to not use simply yourselves and your own subjective experiences alone as the governing force in your assessments of how valid other things can be. To put it more simply, Just because you might not like it in this moment does not mean it has no value at all. Okay. So with something like the classics, with something like Greek myths, a lot of people have loved these, and that's putting it very mildly. 3,000 years of human history, people have just loved these things. They're still here and still taught and still absorbed to this day. Okay. Which tells you something, which says, okay, there's something here that people really, really like and that people find very, very valuable. So if you can't see that, that's kind of what we're here for. We're trying to be able to expose you to that. Now, if you go through a piece of literature, a piece of artwork like Greek myths, and if you read it, if you study it, if you kind of immerse yourself in it, and yet at the end of the day, you still walk out of it saying, it's not really for me though. I kind of see why it's a thing. I see how valuable it is, but in my personal taste, I'm not a huge fan. That's fine. That's valid. Okay. I like to tell my students that's kind of what you need to go for. So if there's something you don't agree with, if there's something that you don't find very, attractive in its aesthetics, that's totally okay. But it's not okay to completely invalidate it and say that there's nothing there of value when you barely have begun to understand it. Okay. You need to at least give it the time of day to understand it, to study it, to really open yourself up to it, to be open intellectually, and then make your assessment from there. Okay. So with that said, let's talk about Greek myths. So what is a myth? Okay, I like to open that up to my students pretty generally. So in our notes, you can see there's a little section there for our discussion. Just what is a myth? How do we just define that? And I open up the class, usually I get usually about 4 or so different answers. For example, a myth is something that is not true. Okay, oh, it's a myth. It's an urban legend. It's not real. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, myths are generally quote unquote fiction. But in terms of them not being true, let's hold on to that. Some people say a myth is an exaggerated story that is based on something general that happened in history. It's a little bit more of a sophisticated response, but sure, a myth could be something that we took about someone and we kind of exaggerated it a little bit. Cliche example, the cherry tree of George Washington. Did this actually happen? Maybe in some way, shape, or form, but did it happen exactly that way? Maybe not. Okay, we kind of suspect that's a myth. That's fine. Okay. So a myth is something fictional, a myth could be something exaggerated. What else? Some students say, oh, it's something that's totally fictional. It's totally like just meant to kind of be there to explain things that we don't know how to explain. Okay, so now we have something that's a little bit more of an anthropological reason or explanation of what a myth is. We have stories about, as we're going to see, about the creation of the world, about the different geographical and meteorological patterns in the world. Sure, maybe that's one thing that ancient people tried to do. They tried to say, well, we don't know why, there's just lightning coming out of the blue. Maybe there's someone up there, there's a force up there that's throwing lightning bolts down. Okay, sure. That's one possible way. Another, and probably the last one that I will have students telling me is that a myth is something that is meant to teach you a lesson. It's a story that's trying to teach us something. Okay, that's absolutely valid. Usually people refer back to, even though they're not technically myths, I would say, refer to Aesop's fables. Okay, we have these very clearly fantastical stories with these talking animals, and there's literally a moral at the end of each one. Sure. So a myth could be any of those things. Now, some of the things I would have my students focus on after that sort of a discussion, that sort of brainstorming session. Number one, are myths false? Are myths fictional? To a degree, yeah, I think obviously, right? There's no such thing as a centaur. There's no such thing as tree nymphs, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so does this invalidate the entire genre? Is something being fictitious invalidated entirely? No, I don't think so. Are the myths therefore meant to be things that the ancient people actually believed? Did they really believe that Zeus was up there throwing down lightning bolts, or that Zeus, fought the Titan Kronos? I don't know. It's a debatable topic. My professors usually taught me that the simple answer was no, was that the ancient people, the majority of them knew very well that a lot of the stories surrounding the gods that they worshipped were probably just that. They were just myths. They were just kind of additional stories to teach you something about those gods. They might have believed that the gods existed, but did they actually, have this war with the Titans, all this kind of stuff? Maybe not. Okay, they don't necessarily believe that. So we want to be careful about what we say, what we mean when we say something is not true. Now, at a deeper level, when we say that a myth is something that is fictional or something that is not true, well, then I would simply, be kind of a jerk and say, well, what do you mean by true? What is that? What does that really mean? Because, ladies and gents, when we approach this question, why might people be so interested in myths? Why do we keep coming back to them? There are fundamentally two reasons why these things are so popular and what their real purpose is that links back with that whole question of truth. The first immediate link is that when we look at a myth, there is something going on there that we absolutely can learn from, where we see our experiences, our desires, our struggles being portrayed in these stories. And we see characters and the authors of those stories struggling to find a resolution to those problems, struggling to solve those problems, and struggling to express those problems. So, therefore, one of the reasons why people are interested in myths is because we find them educational, we find them instructory, we find them or instructive, we find them to be something that we can learn from and that we can see our own experiences reflected in. So if you go back to our universal materials, that should sound very familiar. That sounds like the hero's journey, right? That sounds like us trying to solve our problems in life in some sense, almost through our stories. So then if we go back here and ask, hey, are myths true? In some deep kind of mystical way, I think, yeah, they really are true. They might be, in fact, more true in that sense than a purely like biographical, completely nonfiction book. I think they're actually dealing with a level of reality that we all experience very, very deeply, but they're doing it in a very kind of fictional and very kind of fantastical way. Sure. Okay. So that's why we might be interested in myths. Now, what else? So people believe that they could be fictitious. Sure, they could be exaggerated about something that really happened. That's absolutely true. And this is something that's kind of unique about myths, particularly Greek myths, is that when we go through them and we say, well, how do you know that it's fictitious? Like, oh, okay, but there's gods, there's these nymphs, there's all this other kind of stuff. One thing I point out is that, well, wait a minute, where do the myths take place? They take place in the real world. They take place in ancient Greece, for example. Well, that's kind of strange. I thought they were meant to be totally fictitious and just express our struggles and a good narrative. Yeah, but they're also taking place in somewhere real. So when we read like the Iliad or the Odyssey, Odysseus and Achilles go to real places. The Trojan War probably did really happen. So there is an element to which, yes, there's all those deep issues that we're covering as well in mythology, but we're also kind of drawing on the real events of history and certainly the real events of the world today, like the geography of the world. Okay. Are these stories simply meant to express or explain the natural world to primitive people that did not understand it? I would put forward, I would argue that that is only true to a very, very shallow level. I think that's a very simplistic way of summing up myths. Okay, I think that's definitely there. That's clearly there. We see that in mythology sometimes, but the key phrase there is sometimes. It's not the driving force of the myth. So, for instance, when we read the story of Achilles, and we're like, oh, okay, well, Achilles gets shot in his heel and then he dies. Oh, that's where we came up with this whole phrase, the Achilles heel. It's like, is that the real focus of the story? Is that the whole purpose of why Homer and all the Greeks made that story, was to teach you what the Achilles heel was? No, I don't think so. Was the story of Kronos's battle with Zeus simply meant to establish why Mount Etna is always erupting? No, I don't think so. That's not a clear. I don't think that makes any sense. I think it's way too simplistic. There's so much more going on in the stories than just simply explaining natural phenomenon. Now, I think again, it's a tangential thing. I think it's just something that the authors and the culture tacked on to mythology, that we can kind of have this additional little this cute little story as to why we have the natural phenomenon going on around us. Sure. Now, the last reason that there's something instructive. Yes, I think that that's very clear. I think that we see, myths expressing themes and lessons and morals to us all the time. But at another level, and this is kind of the answer to this question as well, why are they so interested in them? Is the simplistic answer, guys, which is also a very profound answer, is that it's simply beautiful to watch. There's something really entrancing. There's something really enjoyable in these stories to absorb and to watch and to see. So I think that's a totally valid point. And I love playing with my students with that question when it's like, oh, what's the point of myth? What's the point of stories? What's the point of literature, art overall? There's really only two answers. Okay, I think it was the philosopher, not Herod, not Hesiod, Horace, who said that it is meant to instruct and to delight. Okay, it delights us. We like watching this stuff. We like reading this stuff. We like immersing our imagination in this stuff. It enriches our life somehow in some subjective, in some kind of aesthetic way. It just does. And then at a very much deeper level, it also instructs us. It helps us. It gives us catharsis with our world around us. Absolutely. My key example of that, of course, is music, right? Music moves us so profoundly. It enriches our experience of our lives so much more. And it also can help us. It can kind of guide us through life and it can inspire us. So sure, that's why we might be interested in these things. Contemporary examples. This is kind of a weird one. Do we see mythology still around us today? Oh, I mentioned George Washington earlier. But again, I think that's a simple example. My more fun example of this is to simply point out that if anyone's been going to the theaters or been paying attention to the media for the past 20 or so years, there's one really clear example of a myth that is being made to this day. I am referring, of course, to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Marvel Comics. Marvel is essentially a universe of stories surrounded by or surrounding exemplary people, heroes with supernatural abilities, with dealing with cosmic issues. However, they are taking place in our world, in New York City. I mean, like the battle with Thanos in Avengers Endgame takes place right here in upstate New York. So, we're using the same elements of mythology to this day in our artwork. And I think that those would classify as contemporary myths. And by the way, if you want to get more into it, Greek myths are retold and told in different versions constantly. So just like the Marvel stories, there are, versions of the stories of the characters that are being reworked and remade to this day. So yeah, I think that's a really clear example of contemporary examples. There's more, obviously, there's a lot more, but that's my favorite one. Okay, so that's an introduction to myth as a genre overall. Now, we get into the Greek myth, okay, the creation myth, right? So that's what we're going to talk about now is creation mythology. So the story of creation, right? How do we explain what that is in the first place? Well, every culture has some mythological or religious or some mixture of the two type of story that explains or tries to explore or communicate how all things came to be. How did we get here? Where did everything come from? How was the world created? All right. Now, what I usually have my students do is go to the website called The Big Myth. Okay. And The Big Myth is a great high school resource. If you go to it, I think it's right. Is it this one? Yeah, I think it's this one. If you go in, hit English, and you're going to see that if your Adobe player is actually working, like mine's not, it gives you a whole geographical map of the world, and you can kind of explore and point out what myth you want from what particular culture. So if you go to the Greek one, this is what you will read from that site. Now, I want to go through this, and I want to take a couple notes as we're going through this. We're going to answer we can leave the multiple choice questions for later. We're not interested in that. I'm more interested in this. These 4 questions as we read this particular story. Number 1, who are the first beings in Greek mythology? What are the main events of the creation myth? So can we summarize the events? Who are the significant children that we see being created here or being born here? And what is created in this story in particular? Okay, so let's go through this story. The earth goddess was formed from a raging chaos which existed before time began. She gave birth to Uranus, the sky, who covered her completely with his starry mantle. The two of them became first husband and wife. They bore many children, most of which were terrible monsters, created creatures with 100 arms, and the Cyclopses, mighty giants with 1 eye each. Okay, first paragraph, that's kind of the opening of this creation story. Now, First thing I want to point out, we have two beings in the beginning. We have the earth goddess, Gaia. Okay, so female figure, goddess, she's the earth. Where does she come from? She comes from chaos. She comes from the raging chaos, right? That's a weird concept, but keep that in mind. So from some formless chaos comes the earth. She gives birth, asexually apparently, to Uranus, the sky god. Okay. Now, that's our first two beings of this story. Technically three, if we want to count the chaos, right? The chaos is kind of like a character almost. And then we have this couple, Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the sky. They have children. Their children are these 100-armed giants, Heacanthropos or something like that, I think they're called. And then the Cyclopses. Okay, there's our first two beings. Now, Uranus feared these powerful creatures, that is his children, and hid them deep in the earth. This caused Gaia great pain, as she loved her children. She became angry and plotted to destroy her husband. Finally, Gaia gave birth to several gods and goddesses who were not fearful monsters. Among them was Kronos, who was strong enough to overthrow Uranus. Gaia made him a sickle fashioned with the hardest rock she knew and gave it to her son with instructions. Kronos hid in his mother's shadow until night fell, and Uranus the sky came to earth. When Uranus was resting at last, Kronos sprang from his hiding place and killed his father with one stroke. Thus Kronos became king of the sky in his father's place. He married Rhea, an earth goddess, and many more children, and had many more children. He created the first race of men made of gold. This was called the Golden Age, when men didn't have to work and there was no suffering or death. But Kronos was cruel and feared his children. Okay, so first conflict we have. Uranus, the sky god, sees his children and is frightened of them. He fears their power, and so he stuffs them back into the earth, back into the womb of their mother. He diminishes his children. He imprisons them. Gaia obviously is not pleased with this. She does not wish to endure that pain, nor does she really wish to have her children imprisoned like this. She loves them. She wants them to grow and be outside. Now, this story goes a couple different ways. This version of the story tells us that Kronos, her most powerful son, kills Uranus, his father. That's one version of it. Other versions, the more kind of PG-13 version, is that Kronos castrates his father. He severs his male reproductive organs. And out of them come Aphrodite, the goddess of lust and beauty. Out of the Aphros, so the foam, comes Aphrodite. That's one version. The main point here, guys, is that we have a conflict between Kronos and Uranus. Okay, we have a conflict between a very tyrannical father and his son who wishes to kind of help his mother. So Kronos does this, goes and he slays or defeats Uranus. And he and his fellow gods is a loose term here. Usually they are defined as titans. His fellow titans go about their lives. He marries Rhea, another titan, technically his sister, right? Incest is kind of like whatever at this stage in creation. And they have children as well. However, notice what happens. Kronos was cruel and feared his children. Something I love to ask my students is, why do you think Kronos is afraid of his children? Well, maybe because he's having a little bit of PTSD about what he just did with his father. So he doesn't want to be overthrown by his children, just like he overthrew his own father. Now, we got two interesting paragraphs here. After each was born, he, that is Kronos, ate it whole with the clothes and all, so he would never be overthrown. Rhea was horrified by this, and with the help of her mother Gaia, managed to give birth to her son Zeus in hiding on the island of Crete. She gave her husband a stone wrapped in baby clothes, and he ate it in one gulp. So to pause here, we see that Kronos, is going in some sense a step farther than his father did. Uranus simply tried to imprison his children, kind of stop their birth, kind of almost something like an abortion, right? Almost something like an enforced imprisonment or enforced pregnancy. Now, or continuous pregnancy. Now, Kronos is going a little bit further. He's allowing his children to be born, but he's devouring them. He's eating them. He's gaining sustenance. He's treating them as something that could sustain his life and his power. Talk about a tyrannical father archetype. Now, I love to show my students this picture, Kronos devouring. If you want to go into Google, search this famous painting of Kronos, devouring his children. It's one of these really like haunting images that we have here of how kind of a nightmarish of a scene this was. So Kronos, chewing his children up. That's one version of how it happens. Other versions or other depictions are literally just like he swallows them whole. Either way, it's meant to be this sort of nightmarish situation. So he does this to his children. Rhea, of course, doesn't want this to continue. So she forms a plan. She saves one of her children and she gives him a stone, which he just eats, in place of it. Now, I think you can actually see this depicted in this little carving here, right? We have Kronos here demanding the next child, the most recent child. And of course, Rhea presents him with the disguised stone. Who, of course, was this? This was Zeus. This was Zeus as a child that we had here that was saved from Kronos. What happens then? Zeus grew quickly to be the most powerful god ever. When he had grown, he returned with an army of Gaia's monsters and the rest of the gods to overthrow Kronos. The war was terrible and went on for years and years and years. All the men of the Golden Age were killed. Zeus freed his brothers and sisters and built the palace of Olympus, where he ruled the earth and all the gods and men. He then married his sister Hera, and they made many children. Zeus had many other women in secret, and they had children too. And soon the world was filled with other gods. Okay, so we have finally the major, kind of the most famous conflict in the Greek creation story. That is the war between the Olympian gods and the war against the Titans. Okay, the Titans and the monsters of Kronos. The war goes on. Suffice it to say, Zeus conquers his father Kronos. Okay, he defeats his father. So he then is named or becomes the most powerful god. He becomes the king of the gods, the Olympian god. All right. And now we're going to skip the rest because we have kind of the discussion of men and how men are created. We're not as interested in that. I was more interested in this this first kind of 2/3 of the story here. So let's talk about this. First beings, we got that. What are the main events of this creation story? We have the kind of overthrowing of generation one father. We have the tyranny and the overthrowing of the second generation father in Kronos. And then we have the establishment of Zeus as the king of the gods and his kind of rule over gods and men. Who are the significant children? Well, we have the monsters of Uranus and Gaia. We have the Titans in Kronos, and we have Kronos' children in what are going to be known as the 6 Olympian gods, the 6 original children of Kronos and Rhea. What is created in this story? Everything, in some sense, right? Everything that really need to be created. So the earth, sky, the creatures that populate the earth and sky, and the gods and the Titans are created here, as well as men. Okay? So that's the story. Now, in class, what I usually have us do is find, like you see, 1, 2, maybe like 3 if we're having a good day, 3 other creation myths from anywhere around the world geographically. So if you want to go and look at the Japanese one and the Swahili one, the Native American one, the Hebrew one, whatever you want, go and find a creation story and answer the same questions. And then what I have us do is simply answer these comparative questions. Find me 2 similarities between these different stories and 2 differences as well, okay? Because they all have some similarities and they all have obviously many little differences as well. And then we have to discuss what are the themes and patterns of a creation story, of creation stories around the world. Well, the example we gave, of course, was here. The creation and structuring of new things, right? There's always the act of creation. There's the act of, genealogy working itself out. There's the act of structuring the world in a certain way, like we saw with Uranus and Kronos and Zeus. Okay, we have that generational, story working itself out, and we have the structuring of the world as we know it today in the Greek myths. What other patterns might you see? I think the main pattern that is present in these stories is some sort of conflict. There's always some conflict, whether it's against the natural world, whether against the gods, whether against men versus men. There's some sort of strife in the world. There's something wrong in the world. There's something messed up about the world's nature, or about the people in the world, or about the gods ruling the world. There's some level of conflict, which I think kind of speaks to, again, talking about the relevance of mythology, I think speaks to humans' general deep-seated intuition that there is something wrong with either them or the world or both. There's something off about everything around us. Okay, we are not totally at home in this world. There's something that kind of makes us uneasy about this world. And the one I like to focus on, of course, the conflict I like to focus on, of course, in the Greek myth is the conflict between parents and children. There is a deep-seated expression of that in Greek mythology. There's something showing you that one of the major conflicts you will see in your life is between you and your parents, potentially. Okay, the Greeks certainly believe that and certainly showed this. And like we talked about with the archetypes, they in our universal materials video, that there is this conflict constantly being dramatized in our stories between fathers and sons, between parents and their between children and their tyrannical parents, right? And the earliest forms of that we might track are in figures like Uranus and like Kronos, these fathers, these parents who want to demean their children and not allow their children to simply grow and become potentially stronger than them, right? So that's something we really see worked out in these myths. Okay, so that's the story of creation. Now, we usually have a nice exercise where we go through and we discuss the Olympian gods, the 12 of them. Sometimes if you want to list it as 14, right? The ones that don't get mentioned that often, but we like to throw in. So let's run through those really quickly, and I'll show you the statues that I have my students compare them to, which we'll do at the end. So we'll go through the Olympians and we'll see if you can identify the statues from artwork, okay? We are not going to explain the complete genealogy, because usually you'll either know it or you will you read about it in another myth. And that's again part of the classwork. And I'm going to focus more on the dominion. Okay, maybe a little bit of symbolism, but mostly the dominion. What do these gods and goddesses rule over? All right, what assortment of things do they rule over? So first we have the three sons of Kronos. Okay, the first major children of Kronos are his sons. Now, we know Zeus, okay? We know Zeus, child of Rhea and Kronos, along with his next two brothers and his three sisters. What is Zeus's dominion over? Zeus technically is the king of the gods. He has dominion over mankind. He also, depending on the myths that you read, has dominion over fate themselves. Some myths will tell you, oh, the fates are above the gods. It's not actual, not accurate always. All right. So Zeus is also kind of the lord over fate. He's the lord over the gods, and he's the lord of Olympus, therefore. But particularly, we like to associate him with the sky, right? So again, going back to these universal symbols, we see that this kind of like masculine figure, this divine figure, is usually associated with the sky. There's something superior, right, higher in our imagination associated with the power of a god like this. Okay, the thunderbolt is always focused with him. Justice is big with Zeus, right? He's usually associated with justice quite a bit as well. Okay, Poseidon, Zeus's brother. Poseidon usually is associated with the sea, right? We associate Poseidon with bodies of water, massive bodies of water. So the sea and the oceans, all this kind of stuff. He's also curiously the god of earthquakes. We associate him with things that shake the earth, as well as horses, because of a somewhat famous myth of a conflict between him and Athena about who would name a particular city after that particular over a god who won this competition. Obviously, Poseidon didn't win, Athena won, and therefore we have the city of Athens, as the myth goes. Poseidon, however, gave as one of his gifts in this competition horses, so he rules over horses as well. His symbol, of course, would be the trident. Right? We love the trident of Poseidon. Hades, of course. We have the god of the underworld, right? The third brother of Zeus, or the third male child of Kronos. He rules over the underworld, rules over the dead, and the kind of justice that comes after death. Now, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, whenever they are portrayed in a lot of our popular stories, we like to associate Hades with something negative. And this something negative and something almost evil. This, I think, is a little bit more of the result of two things, of the culture and also these original stories, general discomfort with Hades, right? We don't like Hades that much. We kind of are a little bit turned off by him because if Hades is appearing in our story, it means someone's going to die, right? Or something is happening with death. So it's kind of a, don't say the name of the devil or he will appear, right? We don't want to talk about Hades too much. But I like to emphasize to my students that Hades is, in fact, as Disney, against what Disney would teach you, Hades is not a villain in Greek mythology any more than any of the other gods are. All right, he's usually just kind of doing his own thing, and he's kind of like the emo kid in the corner that no one wants to talk about, no one wants to talk to because he's just, doing his own thing. He's kind of antisocial. That's how you want to think about Hades. Hades is usually symbolized by his pitchfork, right? He usually has not a trident with 3 points, he has a pitchfork with 2, okay? Now, the 3 sisters of Zeus and his brothers are Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. So with those 3, we have the original 6 gods and goddesses that came from Kronos and Rhea. So Hera, the goddess of marriage, sometimes childbirth, particularly titled the Queen of the Gods because of her marriage with Zeus. She is the figure that we see really embodying that regional source of power, right? The source of power in a queen, in queenship, and the dignity and the responsibility that men have in marriage. Now, of course, that goes awry many different times. As people know about Zeus, he's very promiscuous. He likes to go and sleep around quite a bit, always irritating his wife Hera. Now, her sister Demeter, people are also usually familiar with by her symbol of the cornucopia, right? That kind of like cone-shaped basket with all the food kind of pouring out of it. This is associated with Demeter because she is the agricultural goddess. She's the goddess of the harvest. So she's very, very beloved in ancient Greece, particularly among the farmers, right, among settlers, because of her association with this. Now, Hestia, probably the least known of all 6 of these first gods, because she is the goddess of the hearth and home, as we say, of religious rites, of kind of virginity in that sense. She is the most religious of the gods in that sense. Now, usually associated with fire, fireplace, kind of those religious ritual sort of images and icons. She actually becomes more popular in Roman mythology and Roman religious structures as well, because as we know, the Romans will eventually adopt the Greek gods into their pantheon. Hestia becomes particularly popular there. Okay, so that's the first generation of the Olympians. There are 6 more, however, that come after that first generation. The first, and in my assessment, the most important one to note would be Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto, I think, if I'm getting that right. Now, Apollo is the Greek god of fill in the blank, right? He is the Greek god of a lot of things. He is the god of the sun. He is the god of archery. He is the god of healing. He is the god of enlightenment. He is the god of or truth. He is the god of philosophy. He's the god of plagues in some sense, right? So why, and the god of music as well. Why so many things with Apollo? I don't really know. I think it's kind of linked with, as we're going to see, the Greeks' love and values as a culture on all the things that Apollo is associated with, right? If we see Apollo in artwork, it's usually, as I tell my students, it's usually defined or described and depicted as like, the VIP, or MVP sort of stud, like just absolute prodigy of a guy. Like he's the one that all the girls are chasing after. He's just amazing at every different level. I think that's because he's meant to be just an iconic god. He's associated with the sun, right? Of just brightness, of just everything that's, illustrious and wonderful about life and masculinity and all this kind of stuff. So Apollo is associated with all of those things, particular with the instrument of the lyre. So the sun is a huge symbol with him. The bow and arrow is huge with him, as well as the lyre, kind of that little harp instrument that you will see in Greek artwork as well. Now, we're going to skip a little bit. I want to do this in order. He has a sister who we name Artemis, right? His twin sister. Same mother as well. She, you can kind of see the sequence here, is associated with the moon, whereas her brother is associated with the sun. She's also associated with bow and arrows, but more specifically with hunting, okay, with like game hunting animals. So she's almost the goddess of the hunt and goddess of animals in some sense. Now, Artemis plays a little bit lesser of a role in mythology than her brother. She's not as beloved, but she still is beloved and respected and revered. Now, the next figure we see is Ares, which, if I'm getting this correctly, if I remember correctly, Ares is actually one of the few gods that is a child of Zeus's original marriage, of his marriage with Hera. Ares, very, very misassociated with war. Okay, Ares is, in some sense, the god of war, but in other senses, he's not. The way that I teach my students this is typically that Ares is the god of all of the negative aspects of war. So, in other words, bloodshed, violence, confusion, rage, madness, bloodlust, all this kind of stuff, like guts. That's what Ares is the god of. He is like that rage-filled kind of god. He's that just violent, kind of barbaric side of human nature. That's Ares, okay, the rage god, the wrath god, usually associated with a war hammer or a sword or something like this. Okay, usually like dogs, like hunting dogs. That's Ares. So once you learn a little bit about Greek culture, you start to kind of see actually that if there were one of the 12 Olympians that you were going to depict as a villain, it would probably be Ares. Ares is probably the most negative god in Greek mythology, almost never portrayed positively. He's always someone that's quite negative that we don't want to have around, even more so than Hades. Hermes, a child of Zeus, also the messenger god. Okay, we always depict him with his what's it called? With his winged helmet and his winged sandals. He's the god of flight and therefore speed, travelers and crossways. But more specifically, he's the messenger god. He kind of brings messages and heralds to other gods and to heroes. He's usually associated with his symbol, which is the caduceus. If we actually go and look at that real quick. It's a fun little story about this. Hermes' staff. Yeah, I can never spell caduceus, right? So the caduceus, this symbol right here, was originally, if you have a memory older than the past like 15 years, was a symbol of medicine, right? Was a symbol associated with hospitals. Well, the funny story there is that it actually does not have much to do with healing. It actually was the staff that Hermes would use to carry or to guide souls to the next life. So it's actually a symbol in some sense of the transition of death, right? Now, that's a little bit awkward to have that, in a hospital. The original symbol that they were actually going for, so I've heard, was actually what they have now, which is the staff similar to that, without the wings and without the two snakes, but the staff with one snake, which I believe is not an Aboriginal. I think it might be an Aboriginal symbol of like a healer, essentially. So, like someone twirling a tapeworm out of somebody, right? As a healing process. That's the symbol that we were going for. So Hermes, usually the guide to the underworld, not with healing, all this kind of stuff. Athena, very, very positive figure in Greek mythology and in the Greek pantheon. Athena is the goddess of warfare proper and wisdom. She is the goddess of strategic warfare, of successful warfare, of defensive warfare. That's what she is. So she's really the strategy goddess, the wisdom goddess, right? Associated with her helm, her owl, all this kind of stuff. As we know, as we're going to see in the next kind of section in this unit, she's associated a lot with the hero Odysseus, who is very famous for his cleverness, his wisdom. Okay, that's Athena. Now, Artemis, talked about her already. Aphrodite, another right up there with Ares, really commonly misunderstood goddess. A lot of people say, oh, she's the goddess of love. This is not accurate. And I usually like to reference that story with Kronos and Uranus to really kind of get across what Aphrodite is really all about. Aphrodite was typically, depending on the story, born out of the severed genitals of Uranus. She was born out of the foam of that particular event. So she comes from the male loins. She is, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, not the goddess of love with a capital L. She is more properly understood as the goddess of lust, of the goddess of beauty, of the goddess of kind of adultery, of this like very, very sexual kind of voluptuous sort of imagery, right? She's the goddess of that kind of beauty, of that kind of love. The true Greek god of love is her son, or sometimes an outer entity known as Eros, who we know as Cupid in the Roman name. That's the god of love, right? Not Aphrodite. Aphrodite is kind of a different sort of figure, a different aspect to the romantic life. Usually a negative figure also. She's very, very jealous, very, very kind of don't want to upset Aphrodite for sure. She's a little bit brutal at times. Okay. There's technically two other gods we don't have on here. If you want to add them in, that's totally cool. The ones I'm referring to are Hephaestus, who is the smith god. Doesn't usually get a lot of attention. Usually kind of like the hunchback, the cast out of the gods, but he's always brilliant with his smith work. And then of course we have the god Dionysus or Bacchus, who is the god of wine and drunkenness and revelry and all those wonderful things. He's usually like what I refer to as the frat boy god. He is, in many senses, the contrast to Apollo. He is a popular god. He is a god that expresses some values in Greek mythology or in Greek culture, but not to the negative extent of Ares, but in a kind of foil to Apollo. So we have in Greek culture this kind of give and take between Apollo and Dionysus, the Apollonian and the Dionysian forces. Okay. Generally, now some questions. What things do these gods rule over? They rule over aspects of human life, human actions. They rule over the world themselves, but they also rule over, it seems, or at least have some dominion or have association with human emotions and human actions. Okay, so they rule over the things in the world, to make it really simple. Okay. Now, as a reflection point, I ask my students this: which of these gods do you think would be very positive and beloved by the Greeks, and which ones, what can we infer they valued, therefore? Well, you could go about that in many different ways, but I mean, we know that the Greeks value cleverness. We know that they value philosophy, insight, education, culture, music, athleticism, all that. We, of course, have to jump, therefore, to Apollo. Apollo is one of the most, if not the most beloved gods. A lot of students will say Zeus, and some students actually correct those other students and will say, well, you kind of have to love Zeus, right? Because Zeus is the king, right? You have to follow him. But we do like Zeus still. He's a god of justice. We like to be more just than not in ancient Greece, okay? We like that one. We love Athena, right? Athena is the goddess of successful warfare, of kind of proper defensive warfare and proper strategic warfare. So we love her as well. We also got to love Dionysus. I mean, Dionysus exhibits a lot of the passions and the more the aspects that can get crazy and can get out of control, but are still maybe a bit fun for the Greeks as well. Okay, now those are the gods. Those are the characters. So moving forward in the courses, or in this particular course and other courses, we can kind of get a general understanding of when someone is referencing one goddess or another, or one figure or another, or if there's an allusion to a goddess, we kind of at least know what they're referring to. Okay, now let's take a look, like I said, at those statues real quick, just to have a little bit of a view of these gods. These three boys are pretty easy to identify right off the bat, right? Students will identify Poseidon because of that trident. Sure, pretty easy. Now, this one is a little bit too obvious in my opinion, right? It's got a guy with a pitchfork and a three-headed dog. But we know the three-headed dog has got to be Cerberus, the guard dog of the underworld, the guard dog of Hades. So that's Hades depicted in that statue right there. This one, a little bit more abstract, but as the artist tried to depict here, we have a thunderbolt, right? A bolt of fire, as it seems. That, of course, has to be Zeus. So we have the three major Olympians right there. We then have these three goddesses. Now, let's move myself over here so we can see this properly. We have these three goddesses. We have one holding a cornucopia. Immediately, if we remember, that's got to be Demeter. We have one that's holding a couple different things, but this is supposed to be a scepter, I believe, and we have a crown on this one. So scepter, ruling class, and then a crown. That, of course, has got to be Hera. And we see one here dressed in kind of religious veils, the virgin robes. That, of course, has to be Hestia. Okay. Next, we have these three, a little bit more kind of commonly seen statues. We see someone with a lyre, someone with kind of the beautiful hair and the very, very, accentuated masculine kind of appearance. That's got to be Apollo, right? Upwards, with gold embroidered around him. That's definitely the positive figure of Apollo. This guy here, who I think was meant to be holding a sword or something like that, and a big shield and a big helm on him, it's got to be Ares, right? That's the god of violent warfare. And then similarly, we have a woman dressed in kind of similar attire with that helm seated up on her. And sometimes, usually, she'll have like a war breastplate on. That, of course, is not Aphrodite. That, of course, is Athena. Now we have a woman with a crescent moon, a hunting dog, and then a bow and arrow. That's Artemis, of course. Now this is a little bit of a curveball. We see a guy here with all sorts of plants and kind of curly hair and a fun revelrous robe, some kind of like animal skins on him, and then we have like grapes hanging from his hands. That of course has to be Dionysus, right? That's Bacchus. Okay, so there's the gods. Now we're going to get to three classic myths. Now, I am not going to read the classic myths in all of their detail here, but what I want to do is simply go through them one by one and help us to answer this final analysis question. So I will leave the reading of these particular stories and the multiple choice to you if you're following along with these notes, but I'm going to jump through them and kind of summarize them for you and then help you with that last question. Okay. The first story is the myth of Icarus. Icarus was the son of Daedalus, a famous craftsman who was imprisoned for a bunch of different means. He and his son were imprisoned. While his imprisonment was taking place, Daedalus, through his cleverness, was able to construct artificial wings out of wax and a couple other different materials that would allow him and his son to escape prison. They escape the tower, except in the process of doing so, Icarus is so enthralled by his love of the ability to fly that he thinks that I wouldn't say he feels as though he could do anything. He feels full of the vigor of life and full of the power of life. And he is so enthralled by this that he feels he can go as high as he wants to go. He can fly up at the level of the gods, even. And so he goes up there against his father's warning, because his father knows the practical element of this, that if you go further towards the sun, the wax in your wings will melt and you will not be able to exist up there. You are not meant to be that high and that mighty. You will fail and you will suffer. His son, of course, does not listen. He goes up, the wings melt, and he falls to his death and dies. Okay, so what is the point of the myth of Icarus? Well, it is usually a cliche or a classical example that is a warning of what is the big Greek warning against what? If we remember from our notes, our discussions on tragedy, it is a warning against hubris. It is a warning against that excessive pride. And this is a good introduction, ladies and gentlemen, to one of the main points of Greek mythology. The Greek myths are incredibly consistent with their warning against excessive pride. Greeks like to boast. We see that. They like their boastful heroes, but they don't like this excessive boasting. And we especially don't like when we have a human being comparing themselves to a god, or in some indirect way, putting themselves above the level of a god or at the level of a god. That's not good. Usually I joke with my students and say, as soon as you have someone compared to a god, or as soon as you have someone kind of putting themselves near the level of a god or insulting the gods directly like that, you get about 24 hours, right? Start the clock, because like something terrible is going to happen. So with Icarus, that's what happened. He falls to his death because he thought he was greater than he really was. Okay, the myth of Prometheus, really popular one recently with the new Oppenheimer film. The myth of Prometheus is, of course, of a titan, of this being Prometheus, who wants to give the human beings that have most recently been created, he wants to give them some gift. Now, the reason why he does this, there's a bunch of different reasons. This story has its own reason, but I've heard many different versions of this. Suffice it to say, he, out of either love or out of vengeance against the gods, gives the humans fire, right? He steals fire from Olympus. He takes this divine elements, right? This kind of otherworldly elements, like we talked about in symbolism, and he gives it to mankind. Well, as a result, what happens with mankind? They achieve a new level of power, a new level of capacity, in their development, threatening, a level or an eventual rise to the level of the gods. And as a result, Zeus is livid about this, and he punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock and having an eagle peck out his liver as it regrows every day, but only to be pecked out for all eternity. Right? That's his punishment. Okay, so an interesting myth, again, about the kind of haunting way that humans can feel about their advancements, and that our advancements can get too great and can get too threatening to the gods, or too threatening to us, therefore, and then we need to have a punishment, as a result of this. You might, if you're biblically familiar or literate, you might see the parallel between this particular story and the Garden of Eden story a little bit, right? With the Adam and Eve grasping at the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. You might also see the parallel between this story and the Tower of Babel, a story of human beings trying to build a civilization reaching up to heaven by themselves, right? So what do we see here? We see again this conflict, or this unease, or this fear that humans have of their own power, of their own attempts at mirroring themselves against the gods. Okay, now the final myth is the myth of Pandora, a lot smaller. Most people will understand or will know the reference of Pandora's box, right? Pandora is given this box, which Zeus tells her not to open. And inside the box, or urn, depending on what version you're reading, are hidden all the evils of the world, right? And she, of course, cannot resist the temptation to look inside. She looks inside, and out flies all of the ills of the world, natural and unnatural. Now, an interesting point is that usually in some versions of the myth, hope will come out of the jar as well as the last thing to come out of the jar. However, my classics professors have informed me, and I think rightly so, that we have misinterpreted that ending, and that is a fantastic example of the difference of worldviews when looking at these stories. We look at the story of Pandora and see hope coming out of the jar as the last thing to leave this jar of evil. And we think, oh, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. That's giving us hope for a better future, hope in some sort of resolution, ultimate resolution in this story. However, that, according to the people I have read and the people I've been taught by, is not a proper Greek understanding of what that means. What does it mean? Well, you have to ask the question, why was hope in the jar in the first place? This is a jar of evil things. This is a box of evils, which seems to imply that the Greeks thought hope was evil or bad in some sense. And I think that's the proper reading, as I've been taught it, is that no, hope is bad. Hope is a false hope, usually. You can't always be hoping for that sort of stuff. It's a negative thing to do so, right? You have to be realistic. You have to be ultimately pragmatic, which might in fact be very pessimistic. And you have to deal with that. That's kind of the Greek reading. Now, why did that change? Well, most Greek and classical professors will say because of the influence of Christianity. Christianity in the ancient world turned hope into one of the maximum and like theological and cardinal virtues. And so, as we have really digested that and processed that into our culture for the past 2,000 years, we see hope as a constantly good thing. We've almost, in some sense, divorced it from its theological significance, because that's what the Christians meant in the beginning: is that hope is hope in the ultimate providence of God, the ultimate resolution at the end of human history, or in heaven. It's not meant to be necessarily hope in your immediate situation in life. The Greeks were addressing that point and saying that that's probably bad. Like, you shouldn't, expect that you're going to be cured of your disease. You shouldn't expect that you're going to never be injured. You shouldn't expect you're going to win the battle. Like, you have to be realistic about this sort of stuff. Okay. So, interesting thing with Pandora. What do we see here, though? We see a danger in curiosity. I think it's the curiosity killed the cat kind of story. We see that, again, we see how human curiosity, again, it has a conflict with the gods and what the gods want. And then as a result, leads to some negative outcomes. We saw that with Icarus, and we saw that with Prometheus as well. Okay. So my point here as one of our final questions for this unit is this. When we look at those three stories, those three myths, Icarus, Pandora, and Prometheus, what common conflicts do we see in each of these myths? Based on this conflict, what is the common central idea of these myths? Be sure to give at least two examples from the text. That is, like two either quotations or direct quotations, or kind of a paraphrased description of what happened there. Now, for the sake of our understanding here, I will change this. I'm going to change it in real time. I'm going to say not a common central idea, but I would say a common theme in each of these myths. All right. So I don't want a one word description. I want a theme. I want something that these authors are focusing on that we just talked about, an idea, a concept, and maybe even a teaching that they're focusing on. Okay. So what could we say? Well, we saw the conflicts between the humans and the gods. We saw the conflicts between humans and their own pride and curiosity. And we see humans in conflict with their own ingenuity as well. All right. So what are the authors trying to say, therefore? Okay. Now, for the actual summarizing points of this whole section, and then we're done here essentially after this. Number one, how do the Greeks create compelling and memorable stories such that we still know them to this day? How do we actually, or how do they do this? How does this work? A couple different ways. Number one, like we talked about in the beginning, I think that they just are gifted and skilled in the aesthetics of their particular storytelling techniques. We just really like the quality of their work. That's a pretty simple way to put it, is that they're just well-crafted stories. They have a really good, lasting, beautiful impact. They're fun and they're, good to make into artwork. Another one is that they are tapping in on some deep-seated sentiments and deep-seated fears and even deep-seated problems in the human experience, in our experience as human beings, and in our culture and in our species' experience. And they are depicting them metaphorically, symbolically in these stories, such that when we see them, we at least intuitively reflect our own problems there. The cheesy example, of course, is that when I discuss the story of Kronos and Uranus and Zeus and these family conflicts, what are the students' reactions sometimes? Sometimes they zone in on it because they, at some level, have had a conflict with their parents. Maybe they have a very serious conflict with their parents, and they see it depicted in this like 3,000 or so year old story. It's like, whoa, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, it kind of shows us that, whether it's 5,000, 2,000, 2 days ago, or whatever, we all have some basic experience. The only things that really change in some sense are just our technology or the details of our knowledge, but our experiences and our struggles are the same, ladies and gentlemen, from every aspect of human history. So I think that's one of the reasons why these things are so compelling. Number two, what can we conclude about the values of Greek religion and culture from these mythological texts? Well, we kind of touched on those all the way through here. We see the value on narrative as a big one we didn't talk about yet, though. We see that the Greeks like the stories that are surrounding their religion. You'll notice that Greek religion and Greek stories are not formulaic. They're not very proscriptive. They're not giving you this set of laws and edicts and commandments that we need to follow to the T. They're more interested in giving us stories and kind of enacting rituals maybe on top of or as a result of those stories. That's kind of how they're going. We're going to see this exact same thing in Judaism, by the way. You kind of see the parallels there. Now, we also see, again, with the gods, we see aspects of civilization and religion that they would really value, such as justice, such as beauty, athleticism, insight, philosophy. I'm thinking of course, again, Zeus and Apollo. Pretty easy stuff there. And then for number three, in what way do these myths reflect our experiences of life by using imagery and supernatural elements? Now, that one, again, we have touched on quite a bit, so I will leave that to you. Where do we see our own experiences as human beings reflected in these particular stories? And I would also say, of course, if you have an example of a Greek myth that we did not cover here, because there's a cajillion more, go ahead and explain that to me. Where do we see it? How is the imagery in those texts being used to depict our own experiences in life? Okay, so that is our introduction, our first kind of unit into the ancient Greek unit. After this, next time, we will cover the three major heroes of Greek mythology in Heracles, Odysseus, and Achilles. And then we will move on to philosophy, and then that will be our unit in ancient Greek literature and culture. Thanks very much.